In this video, we'll cover some digital photography basics. We'll look at camera types, how to choose a camera or photo app, setting exposure and white balance, and practicing with a camera simulator. There are a range of different camera types that can be used for digital photo, from smartphones and tablets to point and shoot to mirrorless and DSLR cameras. Regardless of the type of camera you choose, you can still get good results as long as you have the ability to adjust these properties: aperture, shutter speed, ISO, white balance, and focus. Apps for smartphones and tablets can also give you control over these settings. You'll also want a tripod mount. Some are built into the camera body, like this DSLR camera. Other times you'll need separate hardware, like this spring-loaded smartphone clip. Exposure determines the overall brightness or darkness of your photograph. Exposure can be adjusted by changing how much light enters the camera and for how long when you snap a photo. It's controlled by three components working together: shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Let's break down what each one of those means. Shutter speed is how long the camera takes in light as a photograph is being captured. It's measured in seconds or fractions of a second. A choice of shutter speed determines whether you'll have more light or more potential for motion blur in a photo. As we can see in the example photos of a spinning pinwheel, the longer or slower a shutter speed setting, the more motion blur you'll get in a scene with motion. The trade-off is you'll let more light into the camera, which might make it easier to set the other exposure components or adapt to low light settings. Faster or shorter shutter speeds can give you a crisp, freeze frame image in scenes with motion, but that also means the camera is letting in less light, and you'd need to adjust other exposure components or get stronger lighting to compensate. Aperture determines the size of opening the camera uses to let in light when taking a photo. Setting aperture is a choice between a bigger depth of field versus letting more light into the camera. Depth of field is how much of the scene in front of and behind the focal point remains sharp. In this example, we have the same image, taken with two different aperture settings. Notice in both, the central figure is in focus. On the left, more of the scene in the background and foreground is crisp. That image has greater depth of field because it was taken with a small aperture. The trade-off is that small aperture lets in less light, so we'd either need stronger lighting or adjustments to our other exposure components to compensate. On the right half of the image, almost everything in the background and foreground is blurry, and only the subject is in focus. That image has a smaller depth of field because it was taken with a large aperture. Since a bigger aperture lets in more light, that could give us more flexibility with our other exposure components or lighting conditions. Aperture is measured in a unit called f-stops, and it's a bit tricky because a bigger f-stop number actually means a smaller aperture opening, and vice versa. ISO determines how sensitive the camera is to light. Setting ISO is a choice between keeping an image smooth and free of grain versus letting the camera be more light sensitive for low lighting or fast motion scenes. In the example images, a low ISO setting like 80 gives a very smooth image, but the trade-off would be needing stronger lighting or adjustments to other exposure components. As ISO increases, the grain or noise in the image also increases, but the benefit is that the camera becomes more sensitive to light. This can be really good for low light situations or when we need more flexibility for the other exposure components. Anytime a picture is taken, all three components, shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, are working together to set the exposure. Making changes to one means at least one of the others will need adjustment. Sometimes your camera can do that automatically. Other times you'll prefer to set one or more components yourself. We can see how this works with a camera simulator. I'll link to this in the description, and you should use it to practice. On the right, you'll have a set of controls for exposure, and below the viewfinder, an exposure meter. Pay attention to what happens when you make adjustments and click the camera icon. White balance is a way of compensating for different color casts in lighting that your eye may not pick up, but that the camera is very sensitive to. Many times a camera will be able to automatically detect the proper white balance for a scene, but when we get an image that looks very unnatural like the one on the left, It's because the camera was expecting lighting with a different color temperature. Color temperature is measured in kelvins. You can see on the chart here that incandescent lights are a warm orange at about 3000 Kelvin, while a camera flash is white at about 5400 and shade is blue at 8000. Your camera may have a white balance setting that uses icons like these or simply the Kelvin number. Okay, those are the basics of digital photography.